All right, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. Nice and intimate here after the main stage. Can you hear me okay? Just a test in the back? All right, good. Thanks, sound guy. So we've got Thomas. My name is Matt Marshall, founder and CEO of VentureBeat. We have Thomas Dimson, head data software engineer at Instagram, and Aaron Berger, VP of engineering at LinkedIn. And we're focused on these two companies because they have huge scale on their feeds. And one of the challenges for a lot of people, and we want to make sure we understand what your goals are here from the session. Maybe we can make it participatory after going through some of the main themes here. We want to hear, hopefully draw it back to lessons that you can learn from two giants that have, you've heard through the event so far the need to have huge amounts of data, right? You have to have large data to make ML work, and so that's where you start. And so we wanted a specific session. I think this is the only session we had where we're focused on that scale specifically, that scale issue. So with Instagram and LinkedIn, obviously you're all aware of these companies have feeds that are being tailored to your own interests, and there's a significant amount of machine learning that is going into how that works, and there's a fair amount of controversy and feedback that both companies are generating and from their audiences about the interests that are reflected in those feeds. So both very different. So I think it's such a huge theme in terms of ML for these guys. They wanted, hey Matt, what are we going to focus on in 45 minutes? And so we agreed, essentially the starting point is AI specific strategies for keeping a relevant and engaging feed, and what others here can learn from the scale that you're working at, right? So we figured we'd start by providing an overview of what you each do. And what your companies specifically are focused on with that theme in mind. Thomas, you want to start?
Sure, yeah, so I'm from Instagram, hello. I am an engineer. I helped start the feed project, which was changing our feed from a reverse chronologically ordered feed to a personalized ranked feed where we show you the most relevant content to you at any time. And really that problem is, it's fundamentally a machine learning problem, because if you don't do it by machine learning, like let's just say your first thought is like, oh, let's just sort it by the number of likes, then it becomes a popularity contest, and then that's kind of defeating the purpose of this project in the first place. So essentially what we do is we just make little realizable predictions, like about different forms of engagement on a piece of content. So will you like this? Will you comment on it? Will you share it? Whatever you can do on Instagram. And we use that to help inform the order of content on your feed. So if you come and you haven't been on the platform for 2 weeks, there's lots of cool stuff that you've missed. On top is going to be your best friend doing the most amazing thing you ever saw, hopefully, or we screwed up and it's something terrible. So
that never happens, right?
Never happens, machine learning. It's always extremely precise. Cool.
Aaron?
Cool. Yeah, so my name is Ron. I lead engineering for our consumer products at LinkedIn, but for, obviously feed is a core part of what we do on the consumer side, trying to help professionals stay informed, engage in conversations, both about what they do and their areas of expertise, but also their professional areas of interest. And, I think Thomas nailed it. Every time that somebody comes back to LinkedIn and checks out the feed, we're trying to identify, basically create a list, an order list of the things that we think are the most relevant to you in that moment in time. So most relevant means obviously who shared it, and your affinity to that person, who engaged, who's commenting on it, what people who are reading it are like and their similarity to you, what the content is about, and what content you're interested in, and really, I think, frankly, it's just a flavor of the type of things, what we call features that go into the algorithms that decide what the best piece of content might be for you in any moment in time, and that's basically how our feed works.
How are we doing for the back of the room? Can you hear us? You can hear us good, right? Because the main session got started, so I want to make sure, we'll just have to talk closer to the mics, make sure everyone hears. Thanks, guys. So that was a good overview. So you both have to, in prep, one of the things that occurred to me is you both have to balance various interests, right? So on LinkedIn, you've got advertisers, you've got the users, you have recruiters, right? You have content generators. With Instagram, it's a little simpler, right? Because you've got content generators that want to reach people beyond their friends, and then you have.
I think it's both simpler and more complex. Like there's always like every machine learning problem has some weird twist to it that makes it slightly difficult and like
makes it unique, right?
Makes it unique, and like I found that over and over again. Like, oh, this is like a hyper-local machine learning problem, and that has all this little flavor twist. I think Instagram's in particular is just that like, it's a very democratic platform, so the people that are consuming content are also the people that are producing content. It's meant to be for everybody every day, and we want to provide an experience that's good for both parties. And what that means is that our job as like practitioners can actually be much more economics than it is sometimes machine learning, where we're trying to actually balance the graph and make a good experience for everybody on the platform, whether you're a producer, consumer, advertiser. I mean, we don't really divide it into those specific categories, but really just like there's a duality between consumers and producers. And I think on LinkedIn,
it's actually not that different on LinkedIn. I mean, certainly you have kind of maybe subcategories of producers, right? You have, you have influencers who have large followership bases. Same thing exists on Instagram, and you also have people who are posting for the first time on LinkedIn, and we want to give them a good experience so that they get feedback and they feel comfortable and they come back and they share more. And so, and then you have everything in between. You have publishers, etc. So ultimately, we believe that if we construct a feed that is as personalized as possible for our members, that's going to grow the pie for everybody. People will come back to LinkedIn, they will consume the feed more, and that's going to be great for everybody. But we do have to balance things like, hey, if we know it's good for the ecosystem if we get more people contributing and engaging in conversation in the feed. And so if it's the first time you posted for a while, let's make sure that some of the folks that you're close to, that it's important to you if they see your content and they engage with it, that gives you kind of that positive feedback loop that's going to get you to post again. And we know that's good for the ecosystem too. So in terms of balancing, that's where the balance between the contributors and the consumers comes in.
Great. Okay, so that's a good conceptual overview. So it's still pretty high level. I'm just wondering if we could go level deeper into what specific strategies you've developed to increase engagement using machine learning or maybe other related technologies, given that we're focused on artificial intelligence specifically here, engagement or distribution for those other parties that are looking for distribution.
So it's actually, it's a pretty simple answer to that, which is that you kind of organically get that by using machine learning. Like, if you're optimizing for a specific event, this is not exactly what we do, but if you're optimizing for a specific event, let's pick something strange like tapping on a person's profile. If you're ranking the feed in order to prioritize content where you tap that person's profile, that's the type of thing you'll just naturally get more of that in the ecosystem. So if you're optimizing for something that's like engagement or some other loose metric, health of the ecosystem, you'll get that content on top. And because people are consuming that content, that's the first thing that they see, and that's most of their impressions, you'll just naturally get more of that type of thing. And I guess the question that you have to ask yourself is like, what exactly do we want to encourage in the network? And usually what we want to encourage is like healthy, organic, good quality content.
I also think that, and maybe this is unique to LinkedIn, especially since we have both kind of rich media content and text content, that, and we have this, a very, not that Instagram's audience is not diverse, but we understand a lot about our audience. We know that we have, software engineers and marketers and recruiters and lawyers and attorneys, and so we understand kind of what type of content that they are interested in, both based on their behavior on LinkedIn and in the feed, but also based on what other people like them are consuming and engaging with on LinkedIn. And so as what we're really trying to do is play this matching game where we have people who are producing content, whether they're, again, publications or influencers or just individuals who are trying to share knowledge on the platform, talking about certain topics, and we know that there are other individuals who have an interest in that topic, and we try to do this match because we believe that, I mean, not just we believe, the data shows that when we do a good job of matching content and topics to a person's interest, that tends to be more highly relevant for them. And so that's another kind of aspect of how we construct these personalized feeds and give, what we know is give content producers the right audience that they want. There's this great story that I like to tell that there was an article that was published on LinkedIn and now by a large department store about department stores and how kind of the trends with like e-commerce, really hurting that industry. And it was produced by some marketing person who was an expert in that area, and we were able to, through analytics, show them that disproportionately the individuals who read their articles were professionals who worked in department stores, which was amazing to them. Like this is exactly the audience that I want to reach. And so our ability with our profile data and our interest data to be able to match the kind of producers' content, the audience that they want to reach on the platform is pretty awesome.
Yeah, no, thanks. And so specifically, we've heard a lot about how, I think there's a lot of hype around on AI and machine learning now, and we're slapping ML and AI, semantics on top of what is really just predictive math, or what's been used for a couple of decades. But I think what's real. And I think that's why it's a theme at this event is that compute power has developed, and some other technologies, natural language understanding, have converged to allow a whole set of new types of processes. And so I'm just wondering, for you two gentlemen who are at this vantage point of two very large companies with massive amounts of data, you have the data sets, which is the first challenge. What is the most exciting technologies? No, I mean to focus it a little bit. You're laughing at me, but the most exciting technologies. I mean, you mentioned neural nets at one point in our prep, but can you talk a little bit about what you think is the most exciting for you personally, for your teams to develop going forward?
I mean, I'm just excited in general. So
about everything.
I'm an excitable individual.
Oh, okay, so I didn't need to focus. You were okay, good.
But I don't know if everyone has really realizes, there is definitely a lot of marketing hype around AI and stuff, but the type of technologies that are being enabled are absolutely massively insane. In the last couple years, just since I've been in school and been working on Instagram since then, just our progression through image classification, machine translation, auto captioning, these are crazy technologies, and we're kind of on the brink, I think, of something. Specifically for my job, it's actually sometimes a little disappointing. It actually is a little simpler than you think. With the massive amounts of data that you have, and especially the massive amounts of social data that we have, you can do a pretty good job of making ranking on your feed without any of the little fancy things like textual understanding and image understanding. Those things help, but it actually turns out that you'll like things that your friends will like. You'll generally engage with people that you've engaged with in the past, and so those tend to be some of the more important kind of things.
So when you say on the brink, it sounds like you're saying a couple of things here, but I wanted to tease that out. You're on the brink of something, but you're saying it's simpler. You actually don't need to use these tools. We're on the brink of what exactly?
Yeah. So I guess this is me just thinking, but we're on the AI is very, very crazy.
Yeah.
And the current applications, and the interesting it is not that hard to rank a feed in some cases. There's definitely a lot of problems and balancing acts that you have to do. But some of the very, very hard problems in AI are also getting simpler. So this whole advent of deep learning, I think there's a lot of hype behind it, but I think that the main thing is that all these domains, these very different domains, natural language processing and image classification, for example, are all being unified under kind of one big umbrella, and that enables things that are cross-domain predictions. This is not something we necessarily do inside of Facebook / Instagram. It's mostly in terms of like technologies that we see on the horizon. But I'm super excited about that kind of thing because it's getting simpler for people to be AI practitioners, and that's always a good thing, I think. But I don't know.
Actually, I think Thomas nailed the answer to that question. I think the only thing I'll add is that when we're looking at any technology problem that we're trying to solve, and any problem we're trying to solve in our jobs, we're trying to evaluate what the best technology solution is for that problem, and it's not always kind of the most fancy or exciting or a piece of tech or something that has the most buzz. Literally, sometimes the simplest solution is actually the best solution. And so while there is all this hype about deep learning and AI, and frankly, well, I don't think that necessarily the kind of we need to go to the level of sophistication to rank a feed that Google Brain needs to be the world's greatest Go player at Go, right? Like these are actually very different problems, and our problems maybe don't require those kind of solutions. I think that the other thing that is maybe really exciting is the fact that, frankly, every problem that we're trying to solve now at LinkedIn uses some form of machine learning. Frankly, there's maybe no area of our business where we don't use it anymore, and that is, I think, the case for every business, and the fact that it's now totally democratized, and you have platforms that enable companies of any size, even one person who's trying to build a product, to take advantage of these things is awesome, because I think this is how you build products these days.
Can you talk a little bit more about relevance specifically, right? So again, I think that's where it comes back to. You're in a feed, and you both have different approaches to this. You talked about it conceptually, but maybe what are the main challenges that you're both facing now? What keeps you up at night? If there's anything that keeps you up at night, Thomas.
When the systems go down.
Systems going down is, yeah.
Okay.
Still an engineer, so I'm still on call when feed goes down, which is problematic. So obviously those type of things are issues. Actually, what I'm more scared of are things that are more subtle, and machine learning comes with a lot of these problems because there is so much data. There's actually, it can be almost overwhelming to manage sometimes. And so I do worry loosely about that. Like, we have to put a lot of alarming in place to make sure that our data integrity is there. As you're working with distributed teams that are working on the client or on the web or Android, iOS, whatever, you have to make sure that all these signals are still being, they're being sent to you correctly, which is actually a surprisingly difficult job. So that's one thing that keeps me up at night. Like, I also just think that as my job is, I think we also have a pretty strong responsibility to the community of Instagram. And like, we are trying to show you the most relevant content, and that actually is it's a big power, because it's beneficial to people, but it's also a big responsibility. And so I want to make sure that we're still serving relevant content and not like putting our users pretty much first. It's just because we've taken that responsibility.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Thomas's last point, which is we're running hundreds of experiments at any moment in time to try to figure out what is going to create the best feed for people. And if you're only staring at metrics, sometimes you can't see the forest through the trees. So, for example, if we were just ranking things based on the number of the amount of engagement that they had, and we run this experiment that looks to have moved kind of the click-through rate of the top update, and we're not paying attention to freshness, for example, all of a sudden we've constructed a feed for people that every time they come back to LinkedIn, it feels like it's not what's happening now, it's what's happening yesterday or last week, and that's a problem, right? And if you just stare at the metrics, you kind of can't see it. You have to look at the product and how it feels and do user research. And so figuring out a way, I think what worries me is that sometimes we construct metrics that we think are our best approximation of member value, what our members really want, and then when we see the metrics kind of move in a positive direction when we're running an experiment, we're like, okay, this is going to create a great experience. But then when you actually look at the product, it's somehow not that. And figuring out a way. It's just very hard to balance the qualitative and quantitative aspects of our job.
Probably say, just to tie on to that point, like that is something I found over and over again. It's very important to be clear on what you're optimizing for machine learning. Like if you have some ambiguity in your head, or you have like a suite of metrics that you're like, oh, okay, like, we want to make sure that this is good, and like people are sharing a lot, and spending this amount of time, and they're seeing this much video, and they're seeing this much swipeable. Like those are the types of things that start to break down. You start to have arguments on the team about what's important and what's not. So sitting down ahead of time and being like, what really is important for the platform, and what is our long-term measure of success? Plus, how do we back into that to an optimization problem that we can solve every day? Because we're trying to boil down like user happiness into some very concrete metrics, which I think is what you're talking about in terms of qualitative stuff. Like it's hard, and if you screw it up, it's bad. It's a bad experience.
Yeah. And sometimes, and because you're running these experiments, and it like a lot of the time either you don't. Like there's this feedback loop, right? So like we run an experiment that's ranking updates in the feed, and people are engaging with it, which generates more data that feeds back in the algorithm, and so that theoretically, like what you see initially in terms of results may not be where the relevance algorithm or the recommendations are going to wind up. And so again, we have to be very thoughtful and run these experiments for a long time to make sure that they're actually producing the product that we want. Because the basis of machine learning is I'm throwing a bunch of data at this algorithm that's going to produce some results, and I can't always go look at the results and then like draw a line from what I'm seeing to how and why I'm seeing those results, right?
Yeah. So we're getting about halfway through. I want you to think, like I said at the opening, to think of questions you have. Would like to hear your own interests, what you're working on that's relevant to this conversation. Let's see. Any questions now? But yeah, go for it. Yeah. Can you repeat the question, Thomas?
Yeah. So the question is, do we have any AI tools to tell what the photographer was feeling when he took the shot? I wish yes. In reality, probably not. I mean, this is kind of tying to the previous point. It's just like those type of measurements. So I usually think of like user happiness with Instagram when they're consuming Instagram. That's a really hard thing to measure. Like, how are we going to measure happiness without like implanting something in your brain, which we're not going to do. And it's kind of the same thing at the creator side. It's like, how would we really try to find what people were feeling from the actual image itself? I think there are behavioral patterns. We haven't looked into this very much, but like there are behavioral patterns that might indicate some aspects of what you were doing at creation time, such as like what comes to mind are things like, oh, what creative tools did you apply? Like what masks were you using? Those type of things, but certainly none that we've come up with the objective of like, what are you feeling?
It's a hard problem.
Yeah, super hard. So the question was about sentiment analysis to see if we could actually, and mood recognition. Yeah, I suppose you probably could. Sentiment analysis. Yeah, I guess it's like, what would you be using that for? Tying back to what we were just, yeah. Even at a meta point, like what information does that provide that would enable us to make a better prediction of whether you'll engage with a specific piece of content? Is that the feeling or sentiment of the person that was posting it? Is that super relevant? I don't actually know, but I don't know if there's a clear link in my head between the sentiment at posting time and maybe the feeling that you get from viewing it. But maybe there is, and maybe we should look into it. Like yourself, yeah. We certainly do look at, we know things like, is it a front-facing camera, number of people that are in the image, and that sort of thing. So we could use that.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this starts to get into that. We talked earlier about how the most powerful aspects of our personalization algorithms are, frankly, the simplest. And so most of our work goes into understanding who you're interested in seeing content from, and what types of updates you like. Do you like articles, or do you like, jobs, or do you like photos, or like videos? And I think that this next level of like, what is this, like, what's the genre of this photo, right? Is it like people at a happy hour, or is it, a conference or whatever? Certainly understanding that and understanding people's affinities to the like genres and topics and stuff is important and something that goes in. But I would say like maybe that's in the like the last 10% of what we do, where the 90% is more around network and stuff like that.
Yeah, Thomas, would you agree with those two verticals? I think you made that really clear. It's like who do you want to hear stuff from, and what in terms of format. But then the next step is drilling down.
I
into
think that's a nice way of expressing it. It's just like our focus is like on the simpler aspects of this problem in some sense, not on the like deeper on the margins kind of latent feelings. It's more just like, are you interested in this person's content? Typically, are you interested in this particular piece of content? And whatever we can do to make those predictions as accurate as possible, which tend to be very socially based, are very useful.
And I think that like we think about machine learning and relevance. We talk a lot about ranking the feed, but for this specific feature that we talk about, like how likely are you to engage in content of a specific person, like the actual development of the feature is super important, right? We assign kind of like we need to put a lot of science and research and experimentation to try to do better predictions about who you're most likely to engage in content from, right? So it's not simply, our jobs are not simply, given a bunch of updates and our understanding of who you like how do we rank the feed, but like understanding you better as a member and what you're interested in is like a big part of our jobs also. And you'd maybe assume that like, well, the simple stuff, like we'll get all that stuff done in like 6 months, and then like from then we'll just focus on the hard stuff. Like totally not true. Like we've been working on this problem for years. You guys have too. Facebook has been working on this problem for even longer, and even then still we feel like there's low-hanging fruit in kind of what you might call the more simple basic stuff than the more complex stuff.
Great. All kinds of questions. Can we go there first?
Content. How do you train data sets, and how do you machine learn when the content disappears, or is it not really disappearing? And then for LinkedIn, do you ever envision a future where, I know that the idea of sharing content in a professional network is different, but have you guys considered that?
Does LinkedIn have stories?
They're everywhere.
Put them at the top of the feed. So the question was around stories on Instagram, which is a more recent product, I guess the last 8 months or so. And does it present any challenges because it's ephemeral content? And of course, like it is ephemeral. I think you had a point about, is it actually ephemeral? Are we keeping it around? No, secretly we're not. We're very strict about that. We're very, obviously, respectful of our users' privacy. So stories ranking, we don't talk about it a lot, but it's extremely important, and it's very, it's got its own challenges. It tends to be more, you're tapping on a person, you're not tapping on a piece of content, so that comes with its own flavor. Plus, when you tap on that person, you're going to be exposed to a bunch of content that's behind that person. And so the problems are like, they're similar in that sense. Like obviously we keep track of what kind of content you're engaging with and that sort of thing. But it just has its own flavor to it that's a little bit different. You have to optimize for different things. You have to think about things differently. There's not as clear of a signal, like engaging on a particular piece of ephemeral content. You can't like it, for example. That's probably what I would say to that. It doesn't really present a challenge from the machine learning standpoint, just because it's more, again, it's like we're not looking at the content per se. It's really just like the actions of people. Yeah, in stories in particular, it's like there's two attributes. There's the content behind the tap, if you will, and then there's the actual tap itself, which is on a person. So most of our effort goes into the first part, and then obviously there's some understanding things that go in the second part. But it's a fun problem. I like working on it a lot, and it's proven to be quite impactful too. So.
Yeah, and with regards to the stories on LinkedIn question, I think we're basically always experimenting with new types of content on LinkedIn to figure out what works and what people want to engage with. So can't really get into specifics on what product launches we might have, but obviously we've seen the success of stories on other platforms and something that we would maybe experiment with if we felt like it was the right thing for our members.
Is there a question over here?
So if you already have personalization with about 1 million users, what problems am I going to run into scale-wise as I go from 1 million users to personalizing 10 million users? Yeah, so if I have 1 million users and I have personalization running on those million, what scale issues am I going to run into as I go from 1 million to 10 million?
I guess the question is, like, when you're doing machine learning on a scale of like millions, what issues come up when you get to tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions? You know, we're actually getting close to trillion. Like, these are the scale that we're dealing with now.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have to be, so one thing that we've actually been struggling to keep up with is just the amount of data that we get in. It's like insane. We're talking, you know, feed is in the hundreds of thousands of requests every second. And if you imagine the number of features that are being extracted, it's just absolutely ridiculous. So you have to get a little bit clever about, if you don't have the infrastructure to support it, or your infrastructure is trying to keep up, you have to be very clever about how you're sampling your data, just like statistically sampling. And it's a little bit more subtle than you'd expect it to be, just because like a naive sampling, you'd be sampling like individual items, and really you want to have an understanding of sessions, and so you might have to sample sessions. So that's one thing that I'd probably mention. Yeah, it's just funny, it's like in class, you might learn all these crazy techniques like n-fold cross-validation for machine learning or something like that, and at companies like Instagram, LinkedIn, you're just like struggling to keep up with the data that's coming in at all. Those techniques are designed when you don't have enough data, and it turns out that we basically have unlimited data. So you're never bound by data, and the question is like, what do you do with it?
I think the other thing that we've realized as we got to like really significant scales, like really, it's hard to process all that data kind of in real time or near line, and typically you get the best results in personalization if you're you know, the closer you are to learning from real-time signals. And we've seen basically a lot of experiments we run where we had recommendations where most of the results were, you know, processed in Hadoop and then loaded to a data store that made it available online, but that had a latency of maybe 6 hours or more. And then when we move those same systems to basically immediate, right? You take an action, whether it's in the feed or in people recommendations, you take an action, we immediately change the next set of recommendations based on that action. Huge metrics lift as a result, but trying to process massive amounts of data in online systems is actually really hard. So that's another thing. And again, at smaller scale, it might be easier, but then all of a sudden, your systems start falling over when you get to massive amounts of data.
Answer your question. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So if you mind, I can ask a technical question. So you just mentioned Hadoop. I was actually thinking that with the feed, it's more like real time, like more like stream processing rather than batch processing. But you still do some Hadoop, and can you just mention, like, technologically wise, like what's that used for, if that's not a secret? And just a few words about the infrastructure as well. On your scale, I'm very interested.
Sure. I'm trying to think what we've talked about and what we haven't talked about. I was making a general statement when I said Hadoop. I was making a general statement about recommendation systems. All of our feed ranking is done online, right? It has to be. Though a lot of the features that we use in our recommendation algorithms are processed offline and then made available to our online systems. I'm not sure, I mean, maybe we could talk after. I'm not sure if we want to get into the technical details of our infrastructure at this talk, but I'm happy to spend time and talk to you offline.
Yeah, and it's going to be a similar story. Like, there's always a blend of online and offline. Offline comes with advantages like easy to experiment and tell if you're doing a good job. Online tends to be more when you're deploying an actual system, but there's a mixture of everything in our systems.
Any other questions? So one of the things you brought up, we had the conversation earlier. Both all of us, it's how much is lost, right? You talked about facial recognition or sentiment analysis. um, wanting to make sure there's happiness and meaningfulness. So it struck me how much there has been references over the last day to qualitative research, right? So actually, and Stan from Facebook is the product manager of Messenger's talking about how qualitative research was just as important as the other online ways of getting feedback for, say, how advertising is doing in the feed. Can you talk a little bit about what will always be left there? Have you made any conclusions as to what will always have to be defined to qualitative research as opposed to quantitative in terms of getting feedback about what's working and what isn't, right? Advertising, content producer interest versus not. Anything you can talk about there?
Yeah, I mean, qualitative research is extremely important. Sometimes for reasons you wouldn't expect. Like, I've gone on a lot of research trips abroad, and it's just, first of all, building empathy with the people that are actually using your products, especially in like low network conditions and things like that. Just getting in front of people and then just seeing how they interact with it. It's always something different. I live in New York. I watch people in the subway just like going up and down their feeds. I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird. I wouldn't have done that. Or like, why are you going to the tab over there now? Like, those are the types of behaviors you really only see through qualitative research. There's also like, we obviously run like lab studies and things like that where we get actual direct product feedback and like questions about, do you like this piece of content in your feed? And those are also important. I'd like to actually see us do more of that in the future, but personally I've just seen it be very valuable for empathy and then finding these use cases you've never thought of.
Yeah, I think that it's especially, like we construct these, we have these assumptions about what a great product is going to be for our members, and they're not, uninformed. We have a lot of data that tells us what our users want based on their interaction with the product. Then we construct these products, but the reality is that, at best these are hypotheses that actually need to be validated with real users before we even build them in the product. Because user research is super important, and I think that we are wrong. Like we are wrong more often than you'd think about what products we think are going to be great for our users, and we talk to them. They're like, no, that's actually not what I want, or that's not what I want out of my feed. And so qualitative research is super, or user research is super important. Getting that qualitative feedback is super important. It's also important to improve relevance, right? So even as people are using the feed, to be able to say, give them the ability to say, show me more of this or show me less of this. I'm not interested in this type of content. People muting or unfollowing people. These are all, pieces of user feedback, some of which is qualitative, that helps us build better, more personalized models. That isn't just kind of user research, if you will. Does that make sense?
Any other questions? Interests here that we haven't explored so far? Yeah.
So I just have a question about on LinkedIn. Are you going to open up your inventory for advertisers and open exchange, go to a programmatic model anytime in the near future? Is that on your roadmap? So
I am not on the advertising engineering team or the product team, so I couldn't even speak to their roadmap. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I frankly, literally, honestly have no idea.
Yeah, Thomas, same thing.
Yeah. In terms of LinkedIn's product roadmap, I'm not too sure about it. Yeah.
I think we should do stories.
Let's talk offline about it. Yeah. I can't comment on the advertiser roadmap other than just like, it's important that we keep in touch with all our partners inside the company, and like those are the types of things we have to be aware of. And it actually can become a problem as companies grow. It's just interesting communication challenges between different people. And yeah.
So Thomas, you've been relentless. I mean, in the prep for this, when we first had our first conversation about whether you wanted to come, just about your relentless focus on the user experience and no business interests interfering with what you're doing, in terms of the feed ranking, which I find really refreshing, really interesting. Is you've seen Facebook, as a parent company, really focusing on that advertising agenda, and Stan again reaffirming that, right? That it's 100% advertising is the business model, and it feels like Instagram's coming at some point to have to monetize in a bigger way. But I think LinkedIn's maybe further on that journey, obviously, right? In terms of having the advertising pressure. Can you talk a little bit about, so why you can't talk to advertising in terms of where your own activities are, in terms of ranking the feeds, are impacted by those interests?
Yeah. So I know I'll speak to Instagram a little bit, and like I am very adamant that we are focusing on users and user satisfaction as a first most priority. Like we didn't do this to make money. We did this to increase the utility of our product. And typically these type of advertising things sort of follow that. And so that's my model. And yeah, I think a lot of people come to us and assume that, oh, you did this just to make money, but it's really not the case, and we validate that with qualitative and quantitative research that this is a product that is delivering value to our consumers as well.
Yeah, and so we actually talk, I mean, I think Thomas has done a better job of expressing this in this talk, but we have a members first principle at LinkedIn, which is that any product that we ship, any product decision or technology decision we make, we ask if it's going to be good for the members. If it's not, we don't do it. And so when we think about, and it actually aligns really well with business value, right? So like to the extent that we build a really engaging feed and we do a better and better job of personalization, which gets people to come back to LinkedIn more and consume more content in the feed, that creates more inventory for advertisers to market to those people. And so I actually think that if our true north is creating member value and driving engagement in the feed, getting more people to come to LinkedIn more often every day and to consume content and to consume more content, that's going to benefit advertisers as a byproduct. And that's how we think about our feed optimization algorithms.
Yeah, sure.
One last question. So for each of you, in instances you guys talked about optimization, where kind of moving away from that a little bit, did you ever also have experience where you use ML for innovation on product?
Okay, so what comes to mind for me specifically is, so there's a second tab on Explore, on Instagram, it's called Explore. We have an interesting problem that I think Facebook doesn't necessarily have yet, or something like that, where we actually have two main consumption surfaces on Instagram. The first one is a feed where you follow people and you can consume their content, which is ordered. And then the second one is actually a place for you to discover content, discover new experiences that are out there on the platform. This is a project, was one of my early projects at Instagram, was taking our old popular page, which was just showing you popular stuff on the network, and changing it to a personalized, interesting thing that explores what's available on Instagram. And it was a crazy step change from something that was just popular in the past to actually something that's machine learned, personalized, giving you relevant suggestions to you. And we did it in kind of an Instagram-y sort of way where it was very photos first and you could infinitely scroll and that sort of thing. But that's a product that couldn't exist without machine learning. And so that's the first one that comes to mind. We also have other instances the things that you would never expect, like even the masks in stories involve machine learning in interesting ways. Search is a product that doesn't work at all, anywhere without machine learning. So those are other experiences that you wouldn't necessarily know involve machine learning.
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to this earlier. There is. I was, as Thomas was talking, I was trying to scour my brain for a product that we've launched recently or reimagined recently that and innovated on by adding machine learning to it, and it was hard because literally every product, every tab on LinkedIn has, every feature we launch has a machine learning aspect to it. Part of product innovation at LinkedIn is coming up with product experiences that leverage our graph and our data to create personalized experiences. So I don't know that there's anything in specific that I would call out. It's part of doing business.
So I think we got a couple minutes left. One minute left. Last question.
Thank you. What are the different strategies do you use for customer re-engagement? Somebody who has been on your platform but has now dropped off and not coming back.
Okay. Yeah, I can't comment to the specifics for the same reason that I'm just like literally not on that team. There's definitely a growth team at Instagram that makes sure that people are having relevant experiences and not churning out. And you can imagine that, of course, this involves machine learning in interesting ways because we know, like, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of like the reasons why people are leaving the platform and like why, what value we could provide if they were to come back. So it's like a loose answer, but just everything. If you just think machine learning for everything, and like also just that we have an interesting set of content, and we want to make sure that we know how much you would enjoy that kind of content.
Yeah, it's not. I think every company, certainly every social networking company, has basically the same set of strategies for trying to re-engage their users, leveraging personalization, machine learning to try to, understand what, really the problem. I think the way that I would think about this problem is we try a bunch of experiments to bring members back, and we learn what works on certain members. And then we try to understand kind of similarities between members who did come back and maybe folks who we haven't run this experiment on, and we try it. And so like it's just a that's the basics of product experimentation and machine learning. And so is this, it's not without getting into a very, very specific, we did this, we tried this and we tried this and we tried this. We run a bunch of experiments, we learn what works, the stuff that doesn't work, we try to move on to something else. A lot of re-engaging users is trying to help that remind them of the value that they're missing by not being on the platform. So what did they miss since they last logged in? What are their, what's going on with their network, and it's tailored to their interests and what they want to see on LinkedIn.
Great. We're out of time. I heard the claps across the way as another session ended, so at least we went longer than those guys did. We could just keep going on, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Good to be here.